There was no option except China.
Right.
When they wanted to develop their own economy infrastructure. If the Quad can provide that alternative,
Sure.
that is the need of the hour. So I think from that point of view, so if it can demonstrate that it is there to stay, it has concrete items of cooperation, I think that is, well begun is half done.
Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I am Nitin Gokhale. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has just finished a quick tour of the United States, and of course, as usual, packed several programs in that quick tour that he has done. He had a Quad summit with outgoing President, American President Biden. Also had bilateral meeting with President Biden, and of course address the diaspora as he usually does. So what is the takeaway, or what are the takeaways, is something that we are going to discuss. And to discuss all that is with me Pankaj Saran, now familiar face on StratNews Global, former Deputy NSA, also someone who watches the space very closely because he also runs a think tank called NatStrat. So welcome to this program, Pankaj. And
Thanks.
so what is your first reaction to what the Prime Minister's tour has done to India?
Yeah, my first reaction is it's good. Its outcomes are concrete, I mean, in that sense, and purposeful. I mean, they directly relate to our national priorities in that sense. So I think it's time well spent. Although, it's an outgoing president,
Right.
and in a few weeks you'll have the elections.
Correct.
But still, I think this business of the relationship
Yes.
goes on, and I think that's the basic message.
That's true, but also we'll come to the bilateral a little later. But the Quad summit, and we had two leaders there who are outgoing. Prime Minister Kishida is going to step down in Japan, and President Biden, of course, is not running for the next elections. And yet, the Quad seems to have now gathered momentum. It's got some concrete agenda. So how does one look at Quad going forward, say from now to the next 1 year when the new leaders will come into US? Do you think it has now got some heft which worries China, or it's by its own agenda itself, they've got their hands full even without worrying China?
Yeah, look, I think, it began in 2021.
Right.
So this is a Biden legacy.
Correct.
And what I find interesting is that although everyone was fixated on the military and security dimensions, I think in this Quad you've seen a diversification to many, many other areas.
Sure.
Although they have applications, but there are also many civilian areas of cooperation. So that's good, because the Quad cannot just rest on a narrow objective, strategic objective.
Sure.
If the four democracies are to establish something which is stable and which endures, that would be much better. So I think in that sense it's good that you have a much broader canvas. Secondly, I think, when you look at the Indo-Pacific, one of the problems there was that the countries of the Indo-Pacific, and especially the small, vulnerable, fragile, developing, for them there was no option except China.
Right.
When they wanted to develop their own economy infrastructure. If the Quad can provide that alternative,
Sure.
that is the need of the hour. So I think from that point of view, so if it can demonstrate that it is there to stay, it has concrete items of cooperation, I think that is, well begun is half done. So I would say that, and by the time you have the next summit, which will be in India,
Yes.
for me, what is more important is that you would have had some modifications or some evolution in India's own relations with China,
Right.
if you want to discuss that.
Sure.
And if India is going to host it, it will bring its own personality to the agenda. But, when you talk about things like ports and space and, so many other dimensions.
Undersea cables,
Yeah.
Even the cancer cooperation on cancer moonshot,
yeah.
All that they have done.
Yeah, so I think it's important for the region who's watching to see the benefits of working with the Quad.
That's true, but since you mentioned China, in any case, I was going to ask you that because that's the thing that I began with, that whether China is the main problem or not, Quad has now got its own momentum. But since China is, of course, the dragon in the room, if you want to call it, not the elephant, but every country in the Quad has its own relationship with China. And till the other day, I used to hear the other three country diplomats or analysts saying that India is the weakest link in the Quad. With this summit and the outcomes or the agenda that they have set, I think at least they would have realized that India is committed to Quad as anybody else, but it has its own approach towards China, which is fair.
Look, I don't think at every forum and in every grouping and on every occasion, India should be required to prove its allegiance to the cause or to the group.
I mean, they should know that.
I mean, that is too much.
That's
That is
right.
no basis for cooperation.
Correct.
Number one. Number two, look at the facts on the ground. From last year's summit to this year, or from the previous summit to this year's summit, you had a series of US-China high-level engagements.
Exactly.
In fact, I would even go to the extent of saying that if you look at the US-China summitary process, it's an annual summit process. It's like the India-Russia annual summit. They've had a summit every year.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's online or not.
Correct.
But they've had summits every year which have gone on for 3 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours.
Correct.
The Australians and the Chinese have exchanged visits at the prime ministerial level.
Absolutely.
So we can't be oblivious to all
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And, we have our own realities with China. And we will proceed with that. I don't think we need to be apologetic. We don't owe an explanation to anyone.
Correct.
And I think as this thing is evolving, people are beginning to understand India better. And not again do this with us, against us,
That's
binary, what will you do in a Taiwan contingency?
Yes.
I mean, you can throw extreme positions at
Sure.
me
Yeah.
for the sake of a debate.
Correct.
But it's not going to help anyone.
Because that's not practical.
So you either believe what India is saying in terms of its values, in terms of its interests, or you don't.
And what it demonstrates in action. I mean, who else has stood up to the Chinese aggression physically but the Indian army?
I was telling you the other day, I mean, what happened in 2020,
Right.
people need to know.
Correct.
The Chinese know it, but the rest of the world needs to know
Right.
the bravery and the resilience
Correct.
of the Indian armed forces at that time, in those critical few months.
Absolutely.
It's unbelievable story of bravery and sacrifice.
Correct.
And in many cases, even reversal.
Yes.
And so the Chinese have, in parts of that episode, faced strategic defeat.
Yeah.
So we don't have to prove our allegiance to anyone in terms of what our relationship with China. Yes, I firmly believe that, or this is my assessment, that in the next few months you will see some movement in the India-China relationship,
Right.
starting from next month, where Prime Minister will be there at the BRICS summit, along with Xi Jinping.
Sure.
And I suspect there will be some movement, and we all should be ready for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Exactly. No, so actually even the Chinese now want some kind of a breakthrough. If you look at the statements of the ambassador, their actions in many cases, how they are reaching out, trying to reach out to India, it is very evident that even they can't sustain this kind of a logjam, both on the border and in the relationship. And therefore, they would also need this. But no, you're absolutely right. And that's what I keep telling my friends from Australia and US and Japan, that India doesn't need to either explain or apologize. But the fact is that India was the first country to take a position in the Quad to say that there is no military dimension to it. There could be a strategic dimension, but there is not a military dimension. Let's not get there, because everybody's requirement is different. India's concentration on in the Indo-Pacific is actually the Indian Ocean. Correct. And the others are there. So they are beginning to understand now, I think, and therefore you see bilaterally India-Australia defense cooperation, for instance, has really grown tremendously.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at each of the four Quad, the bilateral defense and military relationships have galloped.
Absolutely.
And, the question is whether you want that happening, or you want Quad happening, or you want both happening, and at the same rate and the same speed.
Right.
These are difficult decisions.
Correct.
The fact of the matter is we were, quick off the block when it came to the bilateral track with the US, Japan and Australia.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, look, France is not a member of the Quad.
Yes.
But the India-France relationship is solid. It predates the Quad.
Yes.
And it is hugely substantive.
Very.
So I think what we have to do is to say, look, this is my objective and these are instrumentalities I will use. If the Quad fits in with my objective, I will use Quad. But it can't be the other way around.
And we are the only, I mean, they should take advantage of this, the other three Quad members, that India is also a member of the SCO and the BRICS, which none of them are. But anyway, that's a light on the lighter side. But let me come to the bilateral, since we were speaking about bilaterals. India-US bilateral relationship under President Biden and Prime Minister Modi in his second term and now the third term has really expanded. I mean, the White House fact sheet or Indian MEA's, Ministry of External Affairs statements, when you see only the facts, it has really expanded. It's got ISET, it's got cooperation on defense and security, industrial defense cooperation. So where do you see this going? And in the sense that there are, of course, other wrinkles in it which we'll talk about. But what is your sense of the bilateral itself?
Yeah, so when you think of it, Prime Minister Modi has already dealt with 3 American presidents.
Yes.
Obama, Trump, Biden.
Yes.
And
probably a fourth one.
Possibly a fourth.
No, definitely a fourth one. Because
definitely a fourth. Definitely a fourth.
Yeah.
So, when you deal with 4 presidents with 4 different personalities and 4 different historical periods of the global situation, that tells you something. And the fact is that the relationship has progressed. In my opinion, in the Biden period, I would single out 3 aspects which were transformative in the India-US relationship. I think first is technology. It has been the game changer and that big moment which everyone was looking for, or the big idea.
Yes.
And everything is revolving around that.
That's right.
ISET was a manifestation, but the idea that technology should be the next trigger and the next, let's say, takeoff point, that is number 1. Number 2 is the defense relationship, both in terms of acquisitions and in terms of exercises and in terms of doctrine to some extent. And I think number 3 is the approach to the Indo-Pacific, where we have seen the Quad summit coming up. So these are the 3. But on the other side, I would say also there are problems.
Yes.
And I can mention from my point of view, I think the downsides of this 4-year period have been some actions taken by the United States in the global situation which have had a detrimental impact on India's own security and strategic choices and options. And so, for example, the Ukraine conflict or the Gaza war or some of the other actions taken by the United States elsewhere. And of course, some of the actions they've taken or the approaches they've taken to India's own internal situation. These have been difficult from an Indian point of view. So I would say these are the drawbacks, not drawbacks, but these are the downsides which have impacted India's strategic choices in a negative way. So we are now, for example, under far more pressure on Russia. On Gaza, again, you know, without condoning what happened last year in terms of the attacks inside Israel, you know, the fact is that you are at a situation where you know, you are confronting basically a genocide of the Palestinians, and you're always on the brink of a war in the region. Yesterday it was Gaza, and today it is Lebanon, and you know, you feel helpless because tensions in this region, whether it is from the Houthis or the Red Sea, you know, your shipping, your insurance, your trade routes, all this is having a big impact on the economy. The Ukraine conflict had a big impact on the economy. These are not quantified, but these are real. So whether the United States leadership, which is global in nature, has been able to prevent these conflicts or wars, or they've been able to provide the solutions, that I think is the second part of the equation I think when you look at India, US, because US is a global power.
Sure.
So,
No, that's true.
you have to look at both aspects.
Yeah, you have to. But do you think US would be receptive to India taking this lead in trying to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia? Because Prime Minister has now spoken to President Putin, spoken to Zelensky twice now. He met him again on the sidelines of the summit there in New York. So, what is the thing? How do Americans look at it in your assessment?
I think obviously the Americans are okay with it. Otherwise, the Indians would not go as far as they have. So obviously there has been some discussion between the Indians and the Americans,
Right.
and the Americans seem to have said yes. I mean, try. So and also I think if they have a choice between who becomes a successful mediator or a peacemaker between China and India, they probably prefer the Indians. But I don't think that's the real issue. The issue here is how much we ourselves want to get into this process
Right.
of mediation that involves the two largest and the most powerful military powers in the world.
Right.
Because this is a much, much bigger game. And the question is how much acceptance you have from both. So far it seems that we are able to utilize our trust with the Russians, and we seem to be trying to also, move forward with the Europeans and the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
But I think this is a grey zone because, the Americans are in a transition. The parties to the conflict are all looking at Washington. They're biding their time,
Exactly.
Waiting till January next
Sure.
year or November next year.
That's what the Russians say. Who do we talk to?
Yeah.
Not to Zelensky, certainly, because
Yeah.
it's an American-driven kind of a war.
So in a hypothetical situation, if you have a US president who comes and says, the first thing on my agenda is to stop this war,
Right.
then maybe you don't need a mediator.
Correct.
Yeah,
He'll just call off supplies or tell
he will
Ukraine to.
he can do
stop.
anything. I mean, so he or she.
Yeah, exactly. We don't know who.
So-
Yeah, so that's where we are. But India's position, in a way, has always been this: that we want peace, not war. Prime Minister has said it twice now in the past 2 years. So let's see what happens on that. In final thoughts from you, there's going to be a BRICS summit in Russia, exactly almost a month from now. Today we are speaking on 24th of September. That's ending on 24th of October. The interest there is not so much in the BRICS summit, but on the two likely bilaterals between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, and Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. Do you think President Putin will try and play a peacemaker between India and China? You've been India's ambassador to Russia, so you may know him a little better than most others.
No, the days for that are over.
Okay.
Because I think in the last few months, we've established fairly high-level contacts with the Chinese.
Right.
In the last few months. So you don't really need a mediator anymore.
Okay.
There was a moment when you may have needed one, and the Russians have in the past always offered their good offices. So I don't think with Russia or with Putin the discussion will be on China. I think it's going to be more focused on the western
That's right.
borders. But yes, on the Xi Jinping presence and whether there will be a bilateral, I think this is going to be the biggest story as far as India is concerned.
Right.
And to be honest with you, I think we need to talk to China while maintaining our military preparedness. And I think there are huge lessons we have learnt from 2020 which are not going to be forgotten, at least for a generation. So keeping that aside, there is scope for breaking the ice and moving on some aspects, I think.
Yeah, truly. And in fact, one of the positive fallouts of that standoff, military standoff, has been that the transformation of the Indian military, or the rebalancing of the Indian military, which started in 2020, forced on Indian military really, is now graduated to rebalance 2.0, as the army chief was telling me the other day in one of our interactions. So which means, India has actually reoriented itself towards looking at China as a primary challenge militarily too. and which is a good thing for India. So whatever else happens in Kazan or even otherwise bilaterally would be good for the world, because these are two largest countries.
Everyone's talking to the Chinese. Who's not?
Right, exactly.
The Americans are the first ones to talk.
Yeah.
I told you the annual summits. The Australians, the Japanese, the French, the Germans, the European Union. I don't know who is not talking to them. So why should we be the only ones not talking to them? But we have to do it with our eyes open.
Right.
And
knowing the dangers, whatever
knowing
there
the dangers, and I think the dangers are not just military. That's only one part.
Yeah, the bigger danger is the economic aspects and the embedded nature of a lot of Chinese inroads into the neighborhood, for instance. There are so many other issues there, but we'll see how it goes. But we started off by discussing Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US, but I think we traversed a fair distance elsewhere. But thank you very much for your insights, and that was wonderful. That was Pankaj Saran, our former Deputy NSA, also Ambassador to Russia, and now convener of NatStrat, a think tank, talking about Prime Minister Modi's visit primarily to US, but all other aspects related to it. Do keep watching StratNews Global. You know where to reach us on our social media platforms. Send your feedback, always important for us to know what you think of this content. And of course, keep supporting us. For the time being, it's goodbye.